So in the last video, we talked about the Congress of Vienna, which was organized to figure out what to do after the fall of Napoleon. One of the key decisions made there was the balance of power, which meant that no nation state in Europe should become powerful enough to take over the way Napoleon had. Now today, it makes sense to us that the nation states of Germany and Italy should be allowed to exist, but it wasn't so obvious in 1814, and in fact, the Congress of Vienna was opposed to it. Both of these regions were made up of small nations or city-states, and there was opposition to unification both within and outside the regions. Let's start with Italy. There's several obvious reasons why Italy should be its own nation state. For one, it's a peninsula. Geography creates a nice border for the nation. And language is a great unifier. Religion also unifies the people, as most Italians are Catholic. And don't forget the history. This is the center of the Roman Empire, and where the Renaissance began to bring back the glory of the Roman culture. Are you noticing a bit of a repeat of the factors listed in this unit's first video yet? Finally, the desire for self-determination had been increasing ever since Napoleon took over and put his family members in charge. But there's also reasons why the nations hadn't unified up to this point, even beyond the Metternich system and neighboring countries like Austria forbidding it. Each of the different regions worried about losing power and couldn't agree on what type of government would be best. Should we be a republic or a constitutional monarchy? And while the Enlightenment ideas spread among those who could read, the literacy rate in the region was quite low, so it took longer for those ideas to spread. In France, the publication of pamphlets and cartoons was the thing that really got things moving. And while I said that geography unifies them because it's a peninsula, the region itself is actually divided by a mountain range and rivers, and there's distinct ethnic differences between the northern and southern Italians. Finally, the church opposed it because it would threaten the control the church had. The Catholic Church controlled a lot of land at this time, and they're worried they would lose it. So if there's all these things that are holding unification back, how did they become the country of Italy? Well, it was war with a dash of democracy. After a series of wars between the different small nation states on the peninsula, by 1850s, Sardinia is proving to be the most powerful. And the leaders of Sardinia are in support of the idea of giving the people a greater voice and unifying the region into one nation state. In addition, there's revolts going on all over the region demanding a greater voice for the people. Plebiscites or votes are held where people demand unification with Sardinia, which eventually becomes the Kingdom of Italy, with the King of Sardinia, now the King of Italy. Ta-da! A new nation state is formed. Now the Pope is really unhappy because the Catholic Church did in fact lose control over many of their lands, just like they'd worried about. So the Italian government gave sovereignty to the Vatican, which is one of the smallest nation states in the world today. And today Italy is a successful nation state, a member of the G8, the EU, and an important player in the global economy. Now, unification of Italy does not make everything awesome for them. Early on, it's tough to establish democracy in an area that isn't used to democracy. We even see that today in emerging democracies. The traditions we developed over centuries can't just be forced on a group of people overnight. So it was tough to run a democratic government when there's a high level of corruption. Political leaders were often found granting favors to family and friends, because why wouldn't you do that? Remember that idea of tribalism we talked about in a previous video? In addition to political issues, there were economic problems. Because of a recession, many of the citizens were leaving the country for the New World to get better jobs. Remember, that's how my family ended up here in Canada. So when many people are leaving, that just makes the economy worse. And because Italy is such a young nation state, it has a bit of an inferiority complex. It needs to look powerful in order to protect itself. And what's more powerful than taking over another region? But as the Italians look around, there isn't a whole lot that hasn't already been claimed by Britain or France or Spain. So the Italians build up their army and navy and grab what's left in Africa, including eventually the takeover of Abyssinia. In addition, Italy jumps into the conflict of World War I because they're hoping to get more territory to the north. They even switch sides partway through the war to make sure they're on the winning side to try and ensure they get their land rewards. So the unification of Italy created a stronger state to help promote the nationalist ideals of the Italian peoples, but it wasn't always in the best interest of everyone. Okay, that's a really short summary of things. It's way more complicated, of course, but that's all we have time for. Now on to Germany. Just like Italy, there's a bunch of reasons why the German people should unify, including a similar language and geography, smack dab in the middle of Europe. They also had a similar ethnicity and culture, even though there were regional differences. In the past, they'd been the Holy Roman Empire, or the First Reich, and who doesn't want to be the imperial power again? And the foreign control imposed by Napoleon and later the Congress of Vienna helped to increase that nationalist desire for self-determination. And in order to prevent a foreign takeover, there needs to be a stronger, unified country instead of the separate, smaller states. Finally, there were already steps to unification. There was a trade pact called the Zollverein that established a special economic relationship in the region. So what held the Germans back from unifying? Well, of course, there is that Metternich system and the Quadruple Alliance opposing it. France and Austria were especially opposed because it threatened their power in the European affairs. And while there were ethnic and cultural similarities, there were enough differences that the different nations within the region were not really excited about allowing another nation to rule over them. And that was the big fear. Prussia was the most powerful of the German nation-states, and the other regions like Bavaria were worried that the Prussians would take away some of their sovereignty. But despite all that opposition, Prussia gets things moving. It's a little less democratic than Italy's journey, though. Prime Minister Bismarck said that he would do all it takes to unify the region, not through speeches or voting, but through blood and iron. In other words, militarily taking over other regions. Bismarck also used realpolitik, which is doing whatever you need to do to get things done, even if that includes lying, in order to be stronger than your opponent. Bismarck wages war, makes and breaks alliances, and eventually takes over. One very important region he gains control of is Alsace and Lorraine. You'll hear more about these regions when we discuss World War I. And he makes sure to keep the Austrian territory out of the nation-state of Germany to ensure that the Prussians are always dominant. By 1871, the German Empire is established and we have the Second Reich. And just like Italy, things are not all hunky-dory at first. France is a bitter enemy, and the loss of the territory of Alsace and Lorraine makes things worse. The new government is dominated by the Prussians, which everyone else resents because minority groups are now being forced to assimilate. And like Italy, this young country wants to be treated as an equal by the other older nation-states like Britain, Spain, and France. So in 1884, they host an international conference to settle European colonial claims in Africa, in part to get themselves a little more territory. And those European imposed boundaries are some of the causes of the conflicts we see in Africa today. And the nation-state of Germany was created through militarism, so a militaristic society developed. Germany strove to have the strongest army and navy in the world, which of course leads to tensions that helped to spark World War I. And do I have to point out who started World War II? But again, I'm simplifying very complex ideas here, just so you can get the gist of what happened. An old Social 20 textbook had the chapter heading for this moment in history as the Triumph of Nationalism. Why? Because the Metternich system from the Congress of Vienna failed. Nation-states were created to give national groups their sovereignty. Despite what the reactionaries wanted, we did not fall back into the patterns of monarchies being the center of the nation-state. Instead, the people, regardless of what type of government they had, were the center of the state. Next, we'll look at the unification of Canada and the different perspectives nations within Canada have of the origins of our country.